what I want to talk about very briefly, because I think we are ending this session, but it's important for you to understand how technology has advanced and what issues Islamic scholars have to deal with. You know, crossing human species, or rather a crossing species barrier, is not a recent thing. There was a time in the early 1900s, or rather 20th century, we're talking about 1920s, 1908, there were forums in Western Europe, in Russia, where they decided that, you know, there was this theory called Darwinism. Yeah? Understand that? Everyone talks about that nowadays. People learn in the school. What was the Darwin's theory? Theory of evolution, right? Now, scientists wanted to prove the theory of evolution because that would have really given them a very powerful underpinning of their case. And so what they decided to do was to go to Africa, and they wanted to put a human sperm in a chimpanzee. And so an issue can come out from there called human Z, okay? And so they did all sorts of preparations and came to Africa, and they were unable to do that. They took even chimpanzees from here to Europe, but they were not successful. But then, in our time now, what's happening is that we're now finding that certain cells which are not differentiated yet, they're called stem cells, undifferentiated, they haven't taken any position yet, these stem cells can be introduced to an organ which is badly affected, and that organ can then develop from those stem cells into a new, nice, healthy organ, better organ. They may put the stem cells into a heart, and the heart will recover. They may put stem cells into a kidney, and the kidney will recover, you see. So, but they needed a lot of stem cells. So they have to have a source for that. And so they began this experiment of taking some material from animal cells and some material from a human cell, and they mix it together, and then they started to produce stem cells. Now, in today's technology, you don't have to go to Africa to get a chimpanzee to develop a sperm and egg constitution. You can now develop, you take a sperm from a human and sperm from an animal, and you can develop in a petri dish. Give a right environment, and it will begin to proliferate. Now the problems began that if we began to proliferate this, it will somehow end up with something else than human. Okay, let's the next slide, please. Next slide. Something like that, you see? This is a shimera, which is a mixture of two or more species in one body. So if the fear is that if we allow this combination to grow, it may have a body of a human being, perhaps a head of a cow, a leg of a lion, then what will we do with something like that? Or you can see a head of a bull there, and a leg of a human being. So one has to decide that when these things are produced, what is their purpose? This might have a monkey as a father. Should a monkey have inheritance then? Difficult, isn't it? And what right should we give? Should they have any right? Would you call them human beings, first of all? Next slide, please. You see now, this is just an artist picture. It has a human body, I think a head of a pig, if I'm not mistaken, or some animal. And then all those kids, you see, There is a yuck factor, isn't it? Immediately you feel yuck, what's happening here? Next, please. Or we may eventually develop something like this, who we can train to fight for our land. They will become our army. They can go and fight others. You know, the whole idea of werewolf, interesting. These werewolf, where is it? You see, these werewolves were believed to exist until Middle Ages in the minds of people, 500 years ago. And then what happens after that? Because of that continuous belief that there exists werewolf, if a man, a human being, is covered full of hairs from, say, neck downwards, because he suffered from some condition, people used to regard that this is a werewolf. He's got a human body, but he's got also the animality within it. So there was this idea of a werewolf coming at night and disturbing a good, pious family. Next slide, please. So these are the headlines that have come recently in the West, at least. Chinese scientists at the Shanghai Medical University in 2003 successfully fused a human cell with a rabbit egg. The embryos were reportedly the first human-animal chimeras successfully created. They were allowed to develop for several days in the laboratory dish before they were destroyed. So you see, the stage is already there, the slippery slope is there. In Minnesota last year, at Mayo Clinic, they created pigs with human blood flowing through their bodies. See, so there's already this combination occurring. And at Stanford University in California, they're contemplating doing an experiment to create a mice with a human brain. Because they feel that the more human-like the animal, the better research model it can make so that they could do research on the diseases of the brain that we suffer. Get the point? There's a scientific explanation for that. They say, well, okay, well, let's create a human brain in the mice, and then we can experiment so that we can find out. They want to watch how the cells mature and grow. Why, for example, in the nervous diseases, nervous cells get destroyed? Why? What is it at the maturity stage that is harming them? And why, for example, human heart has a faulty valve? So by doing all these experiments, by creating something like this, they can find out a solution. And recently in the UK, the government did give a go-ahead to create animal-human combinations under certain strict licensing conditions. Next slide, please. What happens is that you take a human cell and you remove all the genetic materials from it. You take an egg from a cow and you remove all the genetic material from there, and then you insert the genetic material of a human cell into the egg cells, which is devoid of all its material. So you have almost 99% human cells in an egg which is belonging to a cow. And the idea is to produce a stem cells so that they can then do research and find out how they can use the stem cells to help the human beings. Next slide. So, and these are the combinations already worked upon. Transfer of brain cells between humans and animals, I've just talked to you about. Transfer of reproductive cells between humans and animals so that we can find out why people have infertility, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go through all that because it can be very boring, but interesting. So many of these combinations are there. So now, what is our view? What should we do? On one hand, there is this idea coming from the scientist that if they do something like that, it will help us. And then we also see that if we allow it to develop into a full state, then we get the pictures that we saw. We can. I mean, no, we haven't produced anything like that because none of the countries so far have allowed it, by the way. UK have introduced this, but in a strict licensing condition. After 14 days, it has to be destroyed. America has drawn a very strict line and says no. But there is this pressure that for research purposes, we must do it. So these are the new areas that even Islam has to give an answer if it has to become relevant. For Islam to be part and parcel of our life, it has to be relevant to our life today. Next slide, please. So the issues, when we talk about this particular combination, the issues relate to human dignity, human identity, acceptable limits, importance of certain body parts. Now, I will just very briefly go through this. Human dignity. If people believe that human being consists of pile of cells, then it would be acceptable to them to do these experiments to a fuller extent, maybe. But then if there are people who believe that human beings are different, that they have souls and they have rationality and they have compassion and they have humanity, they have very big reservations that we should not be doing something like this because it may actually damage the society. And then there are people who would say, well, let's do it, but we have to have a limit because at the end of the day, we are creating this thing to help us. So if we create it for 10 or 15 days and then destroy them, we get the stem cells and we can help our human beings who are suffering from diseases. And then there are other people who say that suppose we begin to introduce a combination cells, stem cells which are derived from the animal and human combined, then the parts that they grow may have an animal characteristics. And if we do a lot of organs like that, then suddenly we find that we don't have a human being, but we may have animal organs, and he may be behaving like an animal. So these are the issues that are in front of us. So let's go into the next slide, please. Look at the ayah of the Qur'an here. We have shaped mankind in the best mold. This is the guidance coming from the Qur'an now. And surely we have honored the children of Adam and we carry them. Verily, all things have we created in proportion and measure. Look at those two words. Best mold. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using these characteristics for us, human beings, for mankind. Best mold. We are honored being. What is there in us that is so essential and so important and which characterizes us? And when we look at this, we would have to investigate the whole concept of the soul in human being then. Because if life is explained in terms of motion, in terms of ability, in terms of knowledge, in terms of perception, then our soul has a unique level of self-consciousness. And it's only given to human being, not to any other creation. And it has a very distinct essence and a distinct identity. That soul has that distinct self-consciousness. That level, that unique level of self-consciousness. And a beautiful narration comes from Imam Ali alayhi salam. Many a times our Imam has produced wonderful work, which Islam and Muslim community, Muslim community sometimes have failed, deliberately sometimes, to recognize this beautiful work of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Imam Ali alayhi salam, Nahjul Balagha. Today the whole concept of Tawheed is given to the world. Pure concept of Tawheed. Not mixed. Anyway. And who asked the question when he was asked about the soul by that faithful companions whose dua we recite every Thursday? Dua Kumail. Kumail ibn Ziyad. Next slide. And that beautiful hadith, the souls are four: the growing vegetative soul, the sensually perceiving animal soul, the rational human soul, and the godly soul. Each one of these have 5 strengths and 5 abilities and 2 properties. You study that, so much you will gain. Imam Ali alayhi salam says the souls are 4: the growing vegetative soul, the sensually perceiving animal soul, the rational human soul, and godly soul. And each one of these have 5 strengths and abilities and 2 properties. What I'll do is very briefly go through these characteristics and then come to a conclusion for all of us, okay? The vegetative soul has the ability to retain, absorb, digest, repel, and growth. Its 2 properties are increase and decrease. Science proves that, and I don't want to go into that at this moment in time, but let me go into the next one. The sensual animal soul has the ability to hear, see, smell, taste, and touch. Its 2 properties are pleasure and anger. The rational human soul has the ability of contemplation, remembrance, knowledge, understanding, and alertness. And the godly soul has the ability to persist after annihilation, after death, in other words, to find felicity in misfortune. Now, annihilation and death, annihilation also in living, by the way, but I think it's a different subject, and Murtaza can deal with that because there's no time. Annihilation, felicity in misfortune, dignity in humility, poverty in needlessness, and perseverance in calamities. Its 2 properties for godly souls are pleasure and acceptance, whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed for you. You accept it. After you struggle, you accept. That's the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. That's a godly soul. So then this narration, it's quite a lengthy one, but this narration indicates clearly that human beings are characterized by ability to contemplate, by ability to remember, by ability to have knowledge and increasing the knowledge, by having understanding and alertness. So in turn, this human soul also possesses animal and vegetative souls in manner that seems to be progressive and evolutionary. In other words, we have been created with this unique self-consciousness within us. And so, if it is correct to say that the faculties of the soul, which I have described, are progressive in human beings, then what would be the result if certain organs were transplanted from animals into human beings or vice versa? Would it affect the entity and or growth of the soul, whether it is separable or inseparable from the being? These are the questions, after looking at this hadith, these are the questions that come into mind. And when you analyze it, it points to one major theme, major conclusion. And that is that if we do this experiment, we have to come to a realization that to what extent our human soul, our self-consciousness will be affected by these combinations, by this entity which are introduced in our body, or if we create another entity. To what extent this soul can then reach its completion, can become honorable, to remain in the best mold as a human being. And to give us some insight, two particular scholars' work have been studied, and that is Ibn Sina and Sadr al-Din Shirazi. Now, I don't want to go into it, but these are prominent scholars. And the conclusion of that was that when you do the overall reading of this subject by them at that time, at least we would be convinced at the very least that the spirit that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala breathes into you, I breathe my spirit into you, a quotation from the Qur'an, at least the spirit plays a part in the emergence of a human soul and its subsequent evolution through its process to actuality. That spirit has a definite part to play in human being's soul. Therefore, if a human being needs to complete its journey towards God, and this requires a stable development of self-consciousness of your soul, with the issuance of this spirit that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, any deliberate animal-human combination or creation, we need to contemplate this aspect of our problem. In other words, would we be able to complete our journey towards God if we introduce things like that? So perhaps from the point of view of Islam, we may find that we have to be extremely cautious about the whole thing, extremely cautious. And the Islamic scholars would need to understand the procedures and the outcome thoroughly before they make any sort of ruling. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.